pleasure of serving as a council member at the City of University Place. And I just want to welcome you all here tonight to our forum. For a long time, public safety has been the #1 priority for our city. And recently, we've heard from many of you, residents and citizens, as well as from our chief, about the need to really refocus on public safety. And we've heard a lot of things around the lack of response times, adequate response times, and we've also heard about the increasing problems with property crimes. Now, both of those two things we believe can be addressed with additional police resources, staffing, patrol officers. And so we want to have a presentation from our chief here in just a few minutes once I stop talking. And he's going to walk us through some of his thinking, some of his planning, how we address those two things, as well as how we can talk about increasing patrol officers and staffing with our police force. Now, our hope is that this becomes an interactive conversation. So don't let the chief stand up here and just talk to you all one-sided. Ask him questions. We want to hear your ideas, and we want to make this a conversation, because it's a key interest of this city council to make sure that we address the #1 priority in our city, which is public safety. And so with that introduction, I actually have it's graduation season. And so I have a family dinner that was long, like 12 years in the making. So I got to make sure I get to it tonight. So, but I'll be back to listen to them. So Chief, all right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Keel. Good evening, everyone. I'm Greg Primo, your Chief of Police here at University Place. Thank you for being here with us tonight, and to those that are watching online as well. Tonight, as Councilmember Keel talked about, we're hoping that this isn't just me presenting, so please ask questions along the way, raise your hand, interrupt. I want to make sure that you get the information that you need. So, as well as we had some questions come in through online, through email and stuff, so Jennifer Hales over here, the city's public safety administrator, she might ask you a few questions that come in through those emails as well. So we'll go ahead and kick off my first slide here. So as Councilmember talked about, the council at the beginning of this year had made their goals for the upcoming 23-24 season, or year, sorry, that public safety was going to be priority #1. And the tasked staff to start some outreach with the community to see what their thoughts are on public safety in University Place. And the step one that we did was we commissioned a survey. So we hired a research firm to conduct, it was in-person, telephone, and web-based survey with 300 residents. It was a long survey. It was a 10-minute long survey around public safety in University Place. And one of the key questions they asked is, what do you think is most important problem facing University Place? So it wasn't just limited, this was an open-ended question. It wasn't limited to just public safety issues. But as you can see from the response, public safety was kind of #1, with crime and drugs being at almost 40%. And kind of really drops off between a myriad of issues below that. But that was kind of the primary thing that came from this survey.
Excuse me, my eyes ain't too good. Can you tell me what those things say? Oh, maybe they look over there. Good. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying to cover everybody, right, with these. Thanks, Amanda. So crime, drugs, obviously, is our #1, and it kind of goes down with traffic and congestion is also related to public safety, with one of the majority of our issues is related to reckless driving and speeding and those types of complaints. So as you can see, that public safety is #1 from our citizens. Go ahead on the next slide for me. So the next, what is the biggest issue that we're facing here in University Place related to public safety is property crimes. Fortunately for us, we do not face the violent crime issue that a lot of the more larger urbanized cities face. the stuff that you see on the news. Our violent crime numbers remain fairly flat over the last few years. So we don't face that issue, right? Our issue is property crimes. That's vehicle prowls, that's vehicle thefts in general from your porch, shoplifting, those types of issues. And these numbers, as you can see, from 2022, so we took January through April and the actual numbers of incidents and projected it out to the end of this year. You can see that we're looking at about a 30% increase in property crimes just for this year. So that's our biggest challenge. And I think that is certainly what I think you probably would agree to as citizens within our community. Somebody probably, somebody of a property crime. What's our biggest way to address property crimes is, I think, is deterrence. There's ways that you as a citizen can try to mitigate and do some crime prevention on your own, but also it's the presence of law enforcement as a deterrence. And then our ability when the crime does happen is to follow up on that crime and do what we can to identify suspects and arrest them. So that's our goal through all of this process. Let's go on to the next slide.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
What's the percentage of people that you have actually arrested as a result of somebody calling up and reporting a theft in their yard or whatever?
So I don't have the specific number on our case clearance in terms of that. It does kind of vary, but our case clearance in general is about 30%. But that would cover not just property crimes, it could include violent crimes and everything else that's included in that. So now talking about staff, I'm sorry, question over here.
How many responses are these answers based on?
There was 300 in the survey. That first slide you saw about what people thought was an issue, there was 300 respondents on that survey.
300, and our population is 32,000?
35.
35,000, okay, so it's...
Right, I'm not an expert on surveys. It is a scientific survey done by a research firm that does this around the country. And they assured us that that's a valid scientific sampling for the city of ourselves. But of course, really when it comes to the end result is whether or not, if this is a levy that goes, the voters will make that decision. It's not the survey that makes those decisions. So next we're talking about calls for service. And these are dispatched calls. So if you can see those numbers, so dispatch calls are calls that come directly from citizens. This does not include activity self-initiated by our officers. So traffic stops, suspicious person contacts, those types of things. These are actual calls that citizens have generated through South Sound 911, the 911 system. And you can see for us, our officers handle a higher number of calls per officer in comparison to a lot of our agencies around us. What does that mean? That means that they're spending most of their time just answering the calls for service. They don't have a lot of time in between calls to do that proactive work. Whether it's sitting on a street side, doing some radar, traffic enforcement, even struggling to get time to do the follow-up on investigative cases. With our staffing numbers, they're pretty busy just handling the calls that come in from our citizens. And then we talk about community growth. I think if you've been here, you know that we're seeing more development happening. We're having different apartment complexes being built, retail establishments that are coming in. All of these require resources from the city, and not just public safety, but mainly from public safety is what we're here to talk about. So as that growth happens, we need to be talking about how do we respond to that with the resources to cover those. Let's go to the next slide. So the next big question is, how do we pay for the police? So in the city of University Place, 100% of your property tax goes to public safety. What I think a lot of people don't realize is only 6 cents on the dollar of your property tax is what the city collects. You can see from this graphic here where the dollar gets broken up into what entities. Schools and fire and the state get a very large portion of your property tax. The city collects that 6 cents, and like I said, they commit that to public safety. Public safety consists of your police department, the court system, the prosecutor, in our jail. We have to pay for all of those things as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about another aspect of property tax, and I'm not an expert in property taxes. I'm not the budget expert, but this question comes up. My house's value keeps going up, and my property taxes keep going up. The city portion that they collect is limited, right? So we don't continue to get that increase. There's a 1% cap that the city can collect, right? That was a voter initiative from years ago. So we start to see that revenue from property tax remaining fairly flat for that the city gets to keep or collects from property taxes. But the costs continue up. And here's another graphic that I think illustrates what I'm talking about. So the very bottom blue line is what the city has collected from you, the average homeowner, on property tax. And you can see it even from 1996 at the onset of incorporation, it has remained fairly flat over the years. Then you have your fire and your school districts, what are voter-approved bonds and levies. And you can see those numbers are based off of your values, your property values. Okay. I know I'm not an expert in property taxes, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I'll do my best, but I have some backup around here too to help me out if I need it.
Question here.
Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, explain again why the police part doesn't go up like the others do,
Okay,
as the property values go up?
okay. Come on. I got some backup.
I'm Eric Faison, Assistant City Manager, and one of my responsibilities is to oversee the Finance Department. Taxes can only grow by about 1%. The amount of money we get every year can only grow in property tax by 1% a year. So if we collected $1 million last year in property tax, we get $10,000 more the following year. The only way to change that is if voters vote to increase the taxes more. And I think all of you might recall there have been votes for fire levies, there have been votes for school levies. There have not been affirmative votes for the city's property tax levy. Is everyone able to hear that?
Does that mean you require a special vote to increase the police funding?
Yes.
Like the school levy, so you would call it a police levy?
Well, it's called, the technical word is a levy lid lift, but essentially we are asking you to, if the council decides to put this on the ballot, we would be asking you to raise your property tax by a certain amount, and that amount would go to police.
And you would publicize it though as a police levy?
Yeah,
and you should, so that folks in general know what the money is going for.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, currently the legislature has been looking at giving local districts the ability to increase that another 0.5%. It was House Bill 1362. So whatever we do here today is likely to be affected later.
Now that issue has been raised a number of times over a number of legislative sessions, and it's never passed.
We have so many Democrats in the legislature right now, I don't see how it will fail.
And there have been a number of Democrats that have been in charge of the legislature for quite some time now, as well as the governor's office, and it has never passed. There's great diversity of politics within each party. You have to admit that.
Question about levy. You folks published how much per house it might cost. When you multiply the number of residents by that amount, what are we talking about that you're annually going to receive?
It's looking at about 1.7 million approximately.
That's per year?
Per year.
That's the increase.
Correct.
And what do you receive now?
I had that written down, about 4-point-something million.
So it's about a 20% increase.
Correct.
And that then, at 20% then funds what you're discussing here.
Correct. And as a reminder, it's not a 20% increase of your total property tax.
Yes,
The city only gets 6 cents out of every dollar, so it'd be the numbers that we publish.
Yeah, we added a new slide up here to kind of talk about what will the cost be. And so this is for the cost for homeowners is $267 per month for every 100,000 in your assessed value. For the average UP home, it's approximately $14 a month or $168 a year. So those are the costs, and now there's probably a question that's like, okay, what am I gonna get for like $14 per
Well,
month?
even before that, does this have a ceiling? Once you get a levy, is it always gonna be whatever this percent is, or are you able, either by inflation or something else, to increase that over the life of the levy?
So then it goes back to the 1% more every year. So
On the
this is-
levies also?
Yeah, because what you're paying now in property tax to the city is a levy. So this would just increase the baseline of the levy, because the cost for the officers grows every year, right? It doesn't go away after 1 year.
Yeah, but we didn't necessarily vote on the other. You're asking us to vote on this. So I
Correct.
treat this differently than what the rest of the robber barons get.
Correct.
It would seem to me that the amount of money that you're asking for is not a large amount in the large scheme of things. And you have a number of items in here. But number 5, I would disagree with. We talked about a young community outreach officer. I think what you need are law enforcement officers, okay? Not social workers, not folks that are do-gooders, as good as nice as they may be. You need law enforcement. Okay? 'Cause what I've seen in the last 20 years here, and what I've seen lately, I mean, our friends' wives got mugged right in front of not Walmart, but in front of Fred Meyer's. Okay, we've seen homeless in cars parked at the park over by Pierce County facility, and these are concerning because there were kids playing at the time. So I mean, if you're going to have only a little bit of money, you need to apply it to where you really need it, and that's law enforcement.
Yeah.
And that's what I would agree with. In fact, I think you ought to increase it a little bit, if you could.
I'll talk a little bit about that position specifically as we kind of talk about what the whole plan is moving forward, and maybe it'll address some of the questions you have about that position.
So I don't know if he was asking this question, but what I would have, is that person going to be commissioned and tacking?
Packing in terms of being armed, no. That would be a limited commission
Not law
person, but
enforcement.
not armed.
Not law enforcement.
So they're not law enforcement. Are they commissioned?
They're limited commission, so they can enforce city codes, but that would be
I
it.
don't know if that's what you were talking. You were talking about somebody who could
Law enforcement.
Right.
give you a
I'll
little
talk.
muscle.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. So let's go on to the next slide then. See if we're getting into our next slide for me. So now I'm going to talk about the components of the plan moving forward. So the first piece that I'm talking about is investigations. And currently in our police department, we have one investigator. That's it. For 35,000 residents, we have one investigator to handle all of the property crimes, some violent crimes that get, so if you're not familiar, the University Place Police Department is a contract agency with the Sheriff's Department. So we're Sheriff's Department employees that the city has chosen to run their police department. So we have complex, right now, if we have a major incident, the Sheriff's Department investigations is the one that comes out and handles those investigations, primarily violent crimes, and anything major beyond that. So the challenge that we have is any of those incidents that happen here go into the pile of all the cases across the county, and the county's resources decide what gets worked. So we're looking at expanding our investigations capabilities here in-house. So if we expand that, then those cases, we don't have to worry about where it might fall when it gets sent downtown to the Sheriff's Department and the follow-up decisions that they make based on their resources. And so what we're looking at is adding another investigator and then an experienced, what we call a detective sergeant position, that is an experienced investigator that can handle more complex crimes. So violent crimes, those types of issues that we can maintain here in-house. It helps us control the cases, make decisions on what gets followed up on, and really impact this community as far as public safety, in my opinion. Make sure I'm scanning the room here. I think I had a question that came in about investigations online that I'm drawing a blank on right now, but I think it was one, and now I'm remembering. So it was in relation to what are we going to do about property crimes. And right now, as I said, we have one investigator, and I showed you some of the statistics, and this isn't anything unique to University Place. Property crime is on the rise across the state, across the region. And right now, that's what that officer's tasked with, is trying to just investigate property crimes. Yes, sir.
What is the financial limit for you to investigate something? Like, I've heard like $900 or something like that. And then if you do find someone, prosecution and repetitive offenses has been really a recurring problem everywhere. And so what can we do different?
So the decision on whether or not a follow-up is done is not based on one factor, like the value of the price. It's going to be based on what evidence is there that we have that we can follow up on. So do we have video evidence? Do we have eyewitness evidence? Those types of things will be a factor. Monetary amount does play into it. If it's just a minor $50, $100 item, then we have to weigh that compared to the $5,000, $10,000 item that was taken. But that doesn't mean that just because it's $50, we don't do anything with it. The goal is to try and address those even lower level ones so that people that commit crimes in University Place know, oh, they're actually following up on this versus what you see in the larger cities where they don't want to do the follow-up on it because they're dealing with the larger violent crime issues and I don't know if you've been watching the news, Seattle's been talking about how they can't follow up on sexual assaults because they're down 40% in their detective ranks. That's the goal. So it's not one monetary thing. As far as prosecution goes, if it is a misdemeanor crime, those are charged through the city. So we have our own prosecutor, and I work with that prosecutor on those types of prosecutions and make sure that prosecutions are being sought on what we think is the value to seek out prosecution. When it's a felony crime, that goes to Pierce County Prosecutor's Office. All felony level crimes go there, and the Pierce County Prosecutor has their own charging standards. We can communicate our desires around cases, but ultimately that is an elected official, and currently she makes those decisions in her office as to what gets prosecuted at that point.
Chief,
Yes.
I just want to give you the context of the question you're asking.
Okay.
Was about photos and videos, maybe talking about how career criminals, people into the area, maybe we aren't able to work those as intensely as your proposal. We talk a little bit about, that was the context of the question you're asking.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we had a question did come in about what happens with videos and what could we... Photos and those types of things, and we're seeing, of course, there's a lot, I'm sure some of you have like Ring videos, the Ring doorbells that take videos from your house. I think that's one of our goals as we expand our capabilities of doing this follow-up investigation is taking some of that video evidence and sharing it. So when we get that, we share it amongst all the patrol, and we can share it outside of our agency when we have good evidence to see if people recognize those individuals. So there's a lot of officers that are out on the street and they come across people and they get to know them, and then they see this bulletin from University Place on a credit card fraud at Fred Meyer, and they'll go, oh, I know who that person is. I've dealt with that person multiple times. Here's that information. And it takes time and resource to be able to put those cases together, and that's, I think, another one of our goals is to expand our capabilities to handle those types of events. Yes?
Would you by any chance know what the average size of a police force would be for a community of this size?
Yeah, I believe we have a slide that I might be able to help answer that question as well. But so I'll say there is no one magic formula that says a community this size should have this many officers. Every community is different, and the type of community in terms of the needs are different, right? And public safety levels vary from community to community. If you look in the state of Washington, University Place has 0.45 officers per 1,000. So we have 16 total commissioned staff, and you have 35,000 residents. We are currently the lowest staffed agency in the state of Washington. If you look at, these are just some cities between 30 and 40,000, and you can see where their staffing lies in terms of officers per 1,000. Now, there's a lot of things that play into these numbers, and that's why I try to stress, don't just look at this one thing and say, oh my gosh, we should be where Linwood is, as much as I would like it as a chief. That's not necessarily what we need, okay? For example, retail. Retail takes a lot of demands on public safety. So if you look like the city of Fife, which is roughly around 11 to 12,000 residents, they have a police force of about 32 officers. But that's because they have a massive amount of retail and industrial hotels and all those types of things, not necessarily a high amount of people. So their number is like roughly 3 or so per 1,000 residents. But they also have a population influx during the day that pushes them to that 30,000 range with all the businesses and stuff. So this does give you an idea of where we lie in comparison in terms of commission staff per 1,000 residents. So I can't say that there is a magic number, but I think there's enough evidence that shows that we're lacking probably to be in comparison to a lot of other cities, at least on the average side of it. If you've lived in the city for a long enough period of time, when this police department was formed back in 1996, we had 24, now the numbers are starting getting 24 or 25 commission staff here. And that number remained fairly consistent up until the recession of 2008. And then in 2009, the city had to make some significant cuts across all staff, not just the police department. And we dropped the staffing in the police department down to 15 commissioned staff. So we've been operating with this 15 to 16, now we're at 16 for quite a while now. And the citizens were asked in 2015, I believe, on a utility tax to try and improve public safety, in which it was voted down. So we've been kind of stuck in this position of 16 for quite a while. Yes, sir.
About 30 years ago, when Pierce County Sheriff's Department was in charge of University Place at that time, they came to the voters and asked us to approve a levy very similar to the one that you're asking for, to add additional police. And the voters voted for it. And within a couple of years, it seemed like there was no change at all. And I worked for a municipality at the time so I was kind of in the loop on this. And I was told that it made not much of a difference because the police in University Place, the extra ones that were assigned, would spend a lot of their time assisting and helping out, like in Lakewood, even Gig Harbor, on assist calls, priority calls, and so we were not covered as well as what we were told we were going to be covered. And I'm just wondering if the same thing could happen here, because there's a lot of crime in Lakewood, and how many of our police would be running over there to assist Lakewood or other communities.
First, on that levy, to those that voted yes, thank you, because I was hired under that levy. We hired about 50, the Sheriff's Department hired about 52 officers in that 1 year. I think the difference that is very key to point out is, at that time, this wasn't a city, this was a part of the unincorporated Pierce County, as was Lakewood. And so the sheriff was responsible for all of these areas and allocated resources at the time to where they felt it was needed, didn't increase staffing in UP necessarily, and then also would pull the resources as they needed them to Lakewood, which was a busier area, or even out to the harbor detachment to help them. The difference now is you're incorporated. You have control of your police department, the number of staffing, and we don't respond to handle calls in Lakewood across the bridge unless it's a huge emergency type of call where we have mutual aid, which is the same thing that we receive from those other agencies when we have a major incident. They're coming in and helping us.
Well, this specific levy was for the community of University Place at that time. I think they were going to hire 5 extra. They were going to be designated just for University Place.
No, you weren't a city yet.
I know,
So I don't know.
but Pierce County made provisions for us to have those extra police officers if we voted for the levy, and we did.
That might have been part of their campaign, is
Yeah.
to say, hey, this is what we're going to do with the 50. We're going to add 5 over here, and then we're going to add some over here, and then it's,
specific to University
yeah.
Place.
In my opinion, that's the benefit of incorporation, is you control it. They're not going outside your borders.
Well, they will though if they get a request for a priority assist call.
Well, that's what I was saying.
Just like
If
Lakewood
there's
would come over and help.
if there's a mutual aid for a major, but I can't tell you the last time that our officers were in Lakewood for a call. That doesn't happen very often. Now, Furcrest, we're very good partners, and we help them out as much as they help us out almost on a daily basis. They have 1 to 2 officers per shift. We only have 2 officers. So in a city of our size, we have 2 working. And so I have 1 that's either at the jail or already on a call, and another call comes out. That Furcrest officer a lot of the time comes over to help us. So we have 2 officers handling a call. And we will help them out as much. But Tacoma, they're pretty well staffed. We rarely ever go into the city of Tacoma. Lakewood, potentially, but it's very rare. They're far more staffed than we are. The city of Lakewood has about 99, 98 officers, commissioned staff, for a city of 65,000. Tacoma is pushing 400 for the city of 200,000. I think they're about 225 now. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, the city was enabled to pass the utility tax here just recently, and I'm wondering if you know why it didn't apply for the police department this time around as to the actual vote the public had before. Yeah, that's a question I have.
So, oh, you can't hear me?
Can you just
Okay.
take it off and talk
Yeah.
so I can see?
So, when we went for the utility tax then, that was for all utilities. At that point in time, we did not have the legal right to tax the city of Tacoma's utilities. That law changed, and so we implemented the tax on Tacoma's utilities, and when we did that, the water actually goes to the public safety department. So the police department already faces a deficit. We do long-term planning in the city. So we could see that, yes, right now we have enough money to fund the officers that we have, but by around 2028, 2029, we're going to be laying off officers. So when the council implemented that utility tax, part of it went to the public safety fund to push out that date so that we made sure we were able to retain our officers over a longer period of time.
The list is about 10 long of the utility taxes applied.
Right, so the only utility tax that was raised recently was electric, water, and sewer. Sewer goes to the street fund to reduce, it kind of ties in. Water goes to public safety, and electric goes to the general fund.
Another question to you then, why is property tax always the first and the foremost attacked, so to speak, since we have such high taxes in University Place? I know sales tax is never a fun one because somebody can buy something somewhere else.
So the city, is regulated by state law, and we only have a certain number of taxes that we're allowed to impose. Other than the B&O tax, which is on businesses, which we don't impose, all other taxes, there's no other source. Any tax that we impose has to be approved by voters.
Has there ever been tax looked at for apartment complexes and the load that they create on the city as far as roads, police, fire, utilities, and per door tax for the people instead of abatements for the buildings?
Again, going back to state law, in Washington State, property taxes have to be uniform. So
surtax, possibly, surcharges.
No, all property taxes have to be uniform. So there is not the ability to tax one group of people or one type of housing as opposed to another type of housing.
But don't
It's
you
the same
usually
rate.
have the authority to impose costs upon them in anticipation that they're going to use more fire, more police, more something else. We see it all the time, that as there's a fee up front to a large conglomerate building something, saying you have an impact on the community that isn't going to be paid for just by the property taxes, you need to pony up front.
Right, and that's called an impact fee. And so impact fees are also governed by state law, and they have to relate to the specific impact. And general fund things like police, fire service, things, schools, you cannot charge an impact fee for those sorts of things.
And when you were talking about fees, you said part of a utility tax is going to the roads. Was that a decision made by you, or was that mandated by statute?
By me? No, it was made by the city council.
Okay, now, what's happening to the 20, 30, or 40 bucks I pay every time I renew the vehicle license on my car? Seems that keeps going up. That was supposed to go for roads.
Yes, and so at the same time the council adopted the utility tax, it reduced the transportation benefit, the car tabs tax, from $30 down to $10.
When did that happen?
At the same time, it was...
No, I mean realistic. Last time I renewed, and I'm in the year of both of my car renewals, I paid the big bucks.
Yep, because most of that's going somewhere else. It's not coming
No,
to
I'm
the
talking the big bucks for you guys from UP. I guess I'm going to have to go out and look at my registration, because I went, it was only 20 last time. How did it get so high?
Yes, it went previously from 20 to 30, and then when council approved this tax, it went down to 10. So take a look at your statements.
I'm going to now.
So.
Thanks, Eric.
I had one more question. So you're saying that does all of our property tax go to the state first and then they disperse, or how does that work?
All of our all the taxes you pay, property tax, go to the county, and then the county apportions it where it's supposed to go. We have different rates for each jurisdiction, and so we get our 6 cents worth of the dollar.
Okay, I think I'm off of investigations and back
Slide
on the
9.
next
Slide
slide.
9.
Slide 9. So now we start getting into the meat and potatoes of what this gentleman was talking about. Like, we need to add patrol officers, and I can't agree more that we need to do something about our patrol staffing. And I mentioned this earlier. We have 2 officers on duty for each shift. That's our staffing levels. So in this proposal, we're going to be adding 2 patrol officers, and the goal is to put them on our swing shift time. So that's that kind of evening. Right now it's a 2 p.m. to midnight. Which is our busiest call volume time period. So the goal is add those 2 in there, and then we'll be able to beef up our minimum staffing from 2 to 3 officers during that time frame. Again, this is just going to help with response times, again, improving officer safety and improving police visibility. I think the biggest example I could share with you is 5 o'clock at 27th and Bridgeport, and we get a collision. I got 2 officers that are working. It's going to take a minimum of 2 officers to handle that collision. Right? You have one that's investigating it and one that's going to be trying to control traffic. Any other calls that come in, we don't have anybody to respond to those. Now, if it's a major incident, something like a shooting or something like that, this is where the mutual aid comes in. The outside agencies would help, and if one of those officers is able to break away, they would, but we would rely on an outside agency for those. But if it's something like maybe a domestic violence call or a property crime in progress, it's going to be very difficult for our officers to break from a 27th and Bridgeport collision with all the traffic at 5 o'clock to be able to break from that to handle that. So that call is going to pen. So when we talk about response times, that's what we're talking about, is our ability to handle the calls during those busy times, to be able to have the resources to respond. And also, when I talked about the number of calls per officer, we can increase that. That gives them more time to dedicate towards proactive stuff, whether they could do some traffic enforcement, but have the time to do some investigations, to spend more time on the calls that they are on, not worrying about the calls that are pending, waiting for them. So that's our goal from the patrol staffing standpoint. Let's go to the next one. So traffic enforcement. So currently in our agency, we do not have anybody dedicated to traffic enforcement. It is by far the number one complaint that I receive is related to traffic, whether it's speeding in the neighborhoods or up and down Bridgeport, reckless driving, those types of things. So the idea is to add 2 officers to our department that are dedicated for traffic enforcement. Now, what we would be placing them is on day shift. It's our highest it's our highest traffic volume time, but also that will help us improve our staffing on day shift. So we have 2 in patrol, and then you'll have a third that will be that traffic officer. Still in a uniform, still in a marked car, not necessarily dedicated to those 911 calls for service, but is still available to assist with those calls, right? It's a normal officer, it's just his primary responsibility is working some traffic-related issues. So it can support that patrol operations and improve our response times during the day shift time. Yes, sir.
I live near Grandview, and since you put in the circles, most of that traffic problem has just drifted away. I love it. Why don't you guys put in more traffic circles? It seems to slow traffic down. People have to be more careful. I have not seen anything since you did the circles on Grandview. I mean, that's one solution. That's a one-time good deal, and you don't have to hire a bunch of folks, for traffic.
I do agree that I think that those are natural calming, traffic calming devices. Some of it, the medians along Grandview also contribute to slowing traffic down. I also get a fair amount of complaints on Grandview of the straightaway speeders between the roundabouts. And then I get complaints about all the roundabouts and the people that hit them, because from a law enforcement standpoint, they're pretty good drunk magnets too. So we do handle a lot of traffic accidents related to them. But yeah, it does help, right, identify them. But I think that's a part of a whole public safety, traffic safety kind of enforcement. It's not just police officers is not the answer. Sometimes it's traffic, mitigation and calming devices, whether it's roundabouts, I'll say the medians and vegetation of those types of things, and then I'll even throw out the idea of traffic cameras. Red light cameras or school speed zone cameras can make an impact. Anything that we can get people to pay attention to their driving and their speed is going to help us. I still think there's a need for officers that are dedicated to provide that, because there's a lot of speeding that happens we can't put a roundabout on every street, on every road.
But which roads are the worst, where where the majority of the offenses occur, and that's where you should put these types of items.
I'm not a traffic engineer, so I don't know all the ins and outs of those things, but yeah, although Bridgeport is a common one that we get a complaint on, because it's one of the few 2-lane roads that we have going through the city, and during commute times, a fair amount of complaints about people speeding right by, and we're not in a position to put roundabouts in the middle of Bridgeport either. So we got to look at it from different angles and ways to approach it, but roundabouts do seem to help in certain areas for sure. Yes, sir.
Yeah, House Bill 1054 that the legislature passed that was limiting your pursuit ability. We've heard a lot about people are just driving away from the police now, and they're not allowed to pursue because of the status that individual has to have met. How are you going to instruct your officers to approach these type of people that are just going to drive off in our city, or get them to pull over?
I don't think we're going to change our approach than what we are right now, because we're under those laws currently, right? So if they're driving away, they're driving away. There's not much that we can do. I think on a political side, we need to work with the legislature to try and address some of those issues and challenges that it's presenting. But again, I don't want to go with this, ignore a strategy over here to try and make an impact on traffic safety by saying, oh, well, people will just drive away from you, so therefore let's not try to pull them over. We encourage officers to continue to try and engage with people, whether it's through traffic safety or just in general making contact with individuals. So 2 years ago, when we were limited by making contact with individuals, the whole Terry stop thing that was taken away from us. We really trained our officers to still try to engage, but if that person is going to run or be combative, you've got to be able to get yourself to step away from that. I think we've got a slide up there to talk about some of the reform things that are up there. It's a little wordy and a little bit small maybe for some of you, but 1054 is the one that did not get, quote, fixed in this last legislative session. And what 1054 says is we are not allowed to pursue individuals, pursue a car unless that person there's probable cause for the occupant of the car for a violent felony or reasonable suspicion for DUI or driving under the influence. So what has that done? Well, what we're seeing is what the gentleman talked about is people are just driving, they're just hitting the gas and going for whatever reason. We're also seeing a massive increase in vehicle thefts. In University Place, we're at 100 and, I think I just saw the stat today, 155% increase in vehicle thefts in the city in comparison to the previous 5-year average for January through May. That is not unique to University Place. That is happening across the region, across the state. The suspects know if they get in a stolen car, it's a property crime. The police cannot chase me. And the probable cause threshold is a challenge for us as well. So if my example that I share is if we have a bank robbery and I have a witness who saw an individual come running out of the bank, get into an orange pickup truck and take off down the road, and then all of a sudden somebody comes out and says that we were just robbed and they call the police, they can say, well, I think that was a suspect that jumped into the orange truck. Now the officer driving to the scene can see that orange truck, but that's not necessarily probable cause to arrest that person. It's reasonable suspicion that they're involved in that crime, but it hasn't reached that level of probable cause. So the officer can try to pull them over, get in behind them, pull them over, but if they take off, there's nothing that you can do. Now, I will say that on a law enforcement standpoint, we are not trying to create more pursuits. We don't want more vehicle pursuits. The issue that we're seeing is that we have kind of created this brazen, disregard for the law. Like even the suspects know that you just can't do anything. I struggle as well as almost I can't speak for every agency, but I can speak for my agency. The decision to engage in a vehicle pursuit, there is all kinds of factors that we have to consider. It's the time of day, it's the type of crime that's involved, it's the amount of foot pedestrians that are out and about, it's the road condition. There's all these different things that we have to consider. And when you have a state law that says, no, you're telling that deputy that's in Okanagan County, and there isn't a soul within 100 miles, that he just had somebody burglarize a house, which is a property crime, cannot pursue that person at all. And I think that's kind of the challenge that we're being faced with. If you pay attention to the news, there's been a lot of kind of news reports mainly from the eastern side of the mountains, some here on the western side, but where they're faced with even in these rural areas where they've had property crime suspects that they've just had to let go. And then they go down the road and commit even more bigger crimes to be violent crimes at that point. So that's a challenge. Yes, sir.
Kind of as follow-up to that, one of my concerns with hiring additional police in University Place, which I think in theory is a great idea, and I have a lot of respect for the police, but I have a concern that they get a shoplifter out of Safeway, say, because now they've got extra cops and they can patrol those areas, and so they get a shoplifter, they take them down, they book them, and it's just a catch and release thing. The prosecutors won't follow up, the judges won't follow up, and so you can have all the police you want, but it stops when they take them down to the county city building and they're released right away. That's my concern. I don't know that hiring all these other policemen are going to solve the overall problem, the underlying problem that we have, and these bad guys are just not being put away, and they need to be.
Yeah, I mean, the criminal justice system is this kind of big animal, right? And all we can control is what we can control. So and the same thing I tell all my officers is, and I practice this from day one, is I do my job. I do my best to keep my community safe that I work in. If the prosecutor is going to choose to do something different, I'll advocate for my case, but there's not much I can do beyond that. As I mentioned before, if we're talking some of these lower level ones, those are cases that we do control because that's a city prosecutor. And we have those conversations and we can prosecute those cases. It's the felony ones that we really lose a little bit of that control because that's handled by the felony prosecutor. The other issue that I think, and I've seen this just in our experience here in my 3 years as your chief, is when we make these lower level arrests and we take them to the jail. Right now, we just looked at the statistics. We're at, I think, 55–60% of our arrests are not UP residents. So these are people that are coming in to commit a crime. They come here, they get arrested, they get taken downtown to Tacoma, they go through the whole process, and they realize, I'm not going to go to UP to do that shoplift because they actually hooked me up, took me down to jail, and now I'm going to have even though it's a misdemeanor warrant, I'm going to have a warrant. Criminals are typically, they do what's easiest, which is another reason why we talk about crime prevention. Let's make it hard for them to steal your stuff. So I agree that there's some challenges in terms of the system and working with prosecutors and judges and holding people accountable. But I feel like we still need to do our job as best we can to put them there in front of those judges to make those decisions. And that's what I think we need help doing through the staffing. Yes?
I'd just like to point out that a lot of these people are elected. District attorneys, judges, so it might be prosecutors, so it might be an area to pay more attention to, go to meetings when they campaign, see what they really stand for, and a lot of these people just they go back and back because nobody cares. They never have any opposition, they never have anything to fight, so maybe we should concentrate a little bit more on those people.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep, she's going back. Slide 11.
Slide 11, yeah. So now we're going to talk about that community outreach officer position. So as we were formulating our staffing plan over the last 1.5 to 2 years, we've talked about what does the university place need, and this isn't unique. This is pretty common in terms of a lot of other agencies that are exploring what is an alternative response level to a fully commissioned officer responding to some calls. And we feel that there is a need for this type of response. So, this is that lower level. So this is maybe the panhandler type situation that's out there. We don't need a fully commissioned officer who's got these other calls for their demanding for their time over here waiting. That we can send somebody that's got a limited commission, is aware of the system, can interview, talk to that individual and see, do I need a law enforcement officer? Do I need to call somebody over here? Or is this somebody that I need to actually connect with some other services? It can take a little bit more of that time and freedom to be able to engage and refer this person to resources that are available within our community.
I
Yeah.
would much rather have you hire 5 law enforcement folks and train one to do your social work, if you really feel that's a requirement. But just hiring a social worker, I hate to use that word, but that's what we're.
Well, it's not a social worker, so I want to make sure that you're aware that it's not a social worker.
I really do believe
Social worker.
5 law enforcement officers is what we really need. And if you can train them all with some of this business here to assist folks who may have other issues, that's fine. But sacrificing someone who could be in law enforcement for that purpose, to me, makes no sense.
Sure. I'll go ahead and let
Yeah,
this go.
I'm wondering, wasn't the fire department interested in doing something similar to what you're talking about? Shouldn't that be part of that? They had their car they were going to drive around and help with.
Yeah, theirs is their coordinated care, I think is their.
Maybe they should be upgraded.
They're referring to just so their idea around that position is frequent callers to 911 for medical calls that are very low level. They're having a coordinated care person go out and try and intervene with those people. So these are typically at residences, maybe a care home that keeps calling 911 on a medical side. And so they're trying to connect those people with providers. This is more of on the street. We have an individual sleeping on a park bench. I think the consensus is we're trying to not have officers engage, and a fully commissioned officer engage on, basically it's not a crime to sleep on a park bench. But maybe they need some of that outreach. And so there's the idea of having somebody that is not a fully commissioned armed officer engaging with that individual and providing that service. All of our officers are capable of doing this. We provide all that type of training because we're not going to always have this resource available. So officers are trained on what resources are available. They're trained in de-escalation. They're trained in crisis intervention and what crisis response resources are out there.
You can hire one more officer for that purpose.
And I am not going to say no to that. The issue is this officer in this position would be about half the cost of a commissioned officer. So looking at, again, impacting all of your property taxes is what we're trying to be mindful of as well. I would love to add 10 officers, 10 fully commissioned officers. But looking at where we need to really focus our energies and what this officer can also provide as in terms of the service to the community, in terms of doing crime prevention and outreach to residences and homeowners association and businesses and all those types of
What kind of salary
things.
are we discussing here for this?
Probably, I would say in about the $80,000 range, but I'm not an HR person, but that's
For this person, 80,000?
Yeah,
Has full benefits.
yeah, with benefits and everything.
Like I say,
The-
5 law enforcement officers.
Come on,
Great,
get on.
great to you.
The officers come with a
We got-
enhanced awareness of hypervigilance that this person may not. And what happens when the person pulls a knife on this? I'll call it a social worker because
Okay.
no matter how you slice it, it is a social worker.
Okay.
So what happens on that when your individual gets carved up or even seriously injured by this person?
We're not going to just send this person out there. We have training to recognize those things and maintain their personal safety, and that's the idea is they're going to be able to read the situation to say, I don't need an officer there for this. There should be nothing that indicates violence to begin with. If it did, then yeah, that's when we want to send the patrol officer over for that.
Fifth guy.
We currently have co-responders. They work throughout the county, so those are mental health professionals. And they require law enforcement to go first. So we have a person that's clearly in some sort of mental health crisis. We're still sending law enforcement to make an assessment, the scene is safe, and then we're calling in the mental health professionals. Again, this person has the ability to kind of, not necessarily the person is in immediate crisis, it's the panhandlers, it's the person just sleeping on the bench, homeless encampment type of contacts, and also just providing some additional presence in our parks. Being able to be a city representative that's out there checking out the parks and calling for uniformed officers if they need it. It's hard to say, let's pull patrol officers to go do those types of things when they have the call volume that they do. I agree with you, adding more would be nice.
So they wouldn't be going to a domestic violence call or any kind of domestic disturbance and that sort of thing?
No, not necessarily any crimes in progress. No crimes. They might be able to help refer people if they were the victim of like a property crime and work through, they've taken a report with them, but they're not responding to calls like that. Yeah, yes?
It's my understanding that when this type of person responds, say a homeless person on a bench, because they're not in uniform, because they're not armed, a lot of times it starts out on a much more relaxed basis. The person doesn't feel like he's being accused of committing a crime right off the bat when he's not done anything. Because from the co-responders, when they come, they have the police there first to make sure it's safe. And this wouldn't even be responding to crimes, so there would be, I don't know, friendlier but safer.
Well, I think in going along the lines of the buzzword of de-escalation, right? So you're bringing officers to a presence sometimes that raises the intensity of the situation when you have an armed, uniformed officer. And now we're bringing somebody that hopefully is de-escalating it just by your presence. Is
Somebody
kind of
who's
a different.
whacked out on drugs and having a
And if that's the
fabulous
case,
mental health
that person should be able to recognize that and step back and go, okay, this isn't somebody, I need a uniformed officer and I need medical aid for that, right?
I've got another dollar
But it's-
question. If this person's getting 80,000 plus, or considering benefits, what have you, the other 6 people, what's going to be their average salary?
So commission?
Yeah,
So right now-
you're talking about 7 people. We've got
Yeah.
the social worker, and then we've got 6 other people.
Correct.
What will their average salary be?
So right now with, I won't say salary, but I'll give you the cost of them fully. So a deputy.
Explain how you arrive at that.
Well, so it's a contract with the sheriff's department, and the county charges the city $190,000 for a deputy. And that includes everything for that officer. That's their car, that's their equipment, training, their car, the liability insurance for that officer. The city, it's all incorporated into the cost of that officer.
Okay, and they also send them to the academy, or they've already
Correct.
been to the academy?
Yes, everybody that comes here has already been with the sheriff's department for a minimum of a year.
Community outreach person would also be under that umbrella?
No, this would be a city employee.
Then the liability for the city would go up if there was an injury in that person going to a case.
Sure, just like any other public works employee getting injured on the job or
As
anything
a
like that.
citizen of the city, I see that as a bad idea. It's too likely that something could eventually happen to that person and end up as a liability.
Chief.
Yeah. Sorry.
Chief, I just wanted to have you maybe talk a little bit about the welfare check study that we did early on and how we found that, was it 20% or 30% of
About
calls
30.
officers are being called, we call it a 911 nation, because when you don't know who else to call, 911, right? So talk a little bit about what we found in that study and how this particular position would
So we took a sample of, welfare checks is our #1 call for service for our officers. And welfare checks can be anything from the person sleeping on the park bench to, sitting in a car, maybe passed out, to so-and-so didn't show up at work, could you go by their house? And we're having to examine, what do we send patrol officers to? Because none of those constitute a crime, right? So this is, again, trying to go, okay, we don't want to send an officer to somebody on the park bench who's sleeping, or we don't want to send the officer to that, but again, who do you send? People are calling. People are demanding some sort of response from their local government to go and to see what the problem is, to check on that person, or to address it in some way. And we looked at all our calls. It was about 30% that we identified that there really was no reason for law enforcement to go there. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody shouldn't go, but having to look at our calls.
You're making it sound like law enforcement shouldn't go. Why not shouldn't they go? I mean, they're uniformed, they're trained, why not go? Particularly, I mean, just because, on occasion, there's a crisis and you're all busy, you can't go, that's one problem. But I can't imagine here at UP that with the number of folks you're thinking of hiring, that why not? These guys that are sitting behind the desk, your so-called investigators, okay, why not they go? Okay,
So-
I don't think sitting behind the desk should be the primary job for folks in law enforcement. If there's a need for the public to be done, something they need help, that should be the priority. And not that these guys aren't doing a good job in their special areas, but why not go? You're not explaining why you shouldn't go to assist these other folks. That's what I don't understand.
So if somebody doesn't show up for work one day, and so the employer calls us, or even a family member calls, and they call 911 because they don't know who else to call.
Sure.
What is the concern about that person? Just what do you all think? What could potentially be the problem with the individual that we need to check on? They died, they're injured, sick, maybe they have that. Does that sound like a medical aid call, or does that sound like a police need to go and arrest somebody? Sounds like a medical aid call to me.
Do they
And-
dispatch?
right?
And saying
What's that?
Do they dispatch medical?
No, because fire won't go to those.
But you could certainly tell those folks who called, you need to call this phone number to get the correct services. That
So,
should be available.
that's what I'm trying to explain, is there is no correct service. There is no other service. It goes to 911. 911 has a choice, police or fire. That's their two choices. And for us, we get those calls because fire says they don't want to go to it because they don't know how safe the situation is. They want police to go. And we're looking at it going, I'm sending officers to see why so-and-so didn't go to work, or there's a guy, like, for example, we had a citizen call about a gentleman in a wheelchair when it was cold in the wintertime wearing shorts down here at 40th and Drexel. Now, does that sound like a law enforcement call, or does that sound like a fire call? It doesn't sound like a law enforcement call to me. It does sound like somebody needs to check on this gentleman, right? It's 35 degrees, he's wearing shorts, he's in a wheelchair. There's a concern there. What we're trying to work with fire to say, that seems like a fire department call. I only have 2 officers working, you have 8 firefighters working out of 1 station. So we're working on those, but in the meantime, we're looking at a lot of those types of calls and going, we need to go, right? Somebody needs to go, but maybe it's not this high level of an officer at 190,000, it's the somebody at 80 to 100,000 that is a much more appropriate response.
And I agree with you, and maybe that particular position may be better funded through the fire department, who has the medical folks and all that. I think law enforcement should stick with their specialty, which is law enforcement.
Yeah, me too, but it's a challenge. Yes, sir.
Another money question.
Okay.
You said your 190K buys an officer, buys a gun, buys a vehicle. Now, in connection with this levy, if in fact it passes, are there any type of one-time expenditures, like, is there room for the people now, or does it have to be a capital outlay to remodel, build, or whatever? Where are you going to house those 7 people? And are there other one-time expenditures that are going to come out of this 1.7 million? And once they're paid for, what are you going to do with that extra money every year?
I don't know if Eric might be able to talk to that, but as far as housing and everything, so the majority of our officers, their house is their car, right? That's their office for the most part. But you do have a fairly new police station. It's just opened 3 years ago, and we have ample room within that. They built it to be able to.
No capital outlay to do anything other than put butts in the seats.
Pretty much, just give me a car and put them in it, and they'll go to work. That's the plan.
And I think that's the benefit of contracting, is the county has a dollar figure, that's a fully paid for officer. It includes all those things that the chief mentioned. The 1.7, remember I talked before that we do long-range planning. So if you do a levy, you may raise excess money in the early years. In the later years, it's a deficit. So the 1.7 is so that we average out enough to pay for those officers for the designated time period.
And what is that?
Faison, what is the actual property tax increase percentage?
I don't have the percentage committed to memory, but as I mentioned, we currently collect a little over $4 million. If we're talking 1.7, whatever that math is, sorry, I'm a lawyer, not a mathematician. So,
I don't know, 6 cents.
Yeah, you have a question?
I'm not sure which way I would go, whether I think that this outreach officer should be considered to go under the fire department or the police department. My only concern with that is with whether or not this position is really necessary. I mean, honestly, it is, because I would rather have my police department worried about serious calls rather than 30% of those types of calls, just to do a check on somebody. Because you don't, let's face it, you don't have enough visibility in the community right now, and you need to see more. The traffic guy has got to be out there a lot, because that's going to make a big difference in most people's eyes. You know, if he's trying to pull people over and they're taking off fine, but he's still got to deal
Yeah, that would be, the intention is they would still have a radio, be able to communicate with the dispatching, because they'll hear those types of calls that are more their level, responding to those calls. And again, it's kind of that conduit between patrol officers and some of the stuff that's going on at that level. And again, back to another component of it is that crime prevention aspect. Being able to go to businesses and sit down and talk about what are things that are going on in your business area and how can we improve the safety around there and what are you experiencing, and then relaying that information to the patrol officers, especially like at night. Those officers are going to kind of higher priority calls on the graveyard time. Businesses are closed and they come into work on the next day and like, oh my gosh, this is what happened to us. Having that kind of conduit to be able to relay what information is going on that those businesses are experiencing with patrol. So it is somebody in the police department working directly with us, but yes, being able to answer calls, having a radio, because there may be a time where they get to that call and they say, this is not what it is, because I can tell you from experience, what we get dispatched to is not always what you're going to face, right? You get a limited amount of information and you show up, and sometimes it's absolutely nothing, and an officer was sent, and sometimes we're going to send somebody that gets there and goes, oh, I need patrol to respond to this, and they're going to step back out and call for the officer for that. That's the intention. Go ahead.
So are the funds that are allocated for this going to be designated just for this, or is it going to be open funds that if it doesn't get designated for this, it's available for something else?
It is just for the public safety. It's just for this hiring additional staff. That's how it would be written, is my understanding.
Correct. And just a reminder that our purpose here is to collect this information from feedback from residents. So comments that, oh, it should only be officers versus outreach person. On the 18th of July, the council is going to have their meeting where they're going to decide what's going to go on the ballot and how much they're going to ask for. And so that would be an opportunity. I saw the mayor raise his hand. Did you want to talk to that?
You've got it just fine. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah. So just wanted to let you know that we are receiving the feedback, and the chief is making clear what he believes is his priorities, but we're taking feedback from the public because ultimately you guys will be the ones who decide how much money this is and whether you want to pay it.
Is there any thought to having a sunset clause built in so you just don't run ad nauseum and continue to use this money for one designation when you could be using other monies down the road?
Again, we do long-range forecasting, and we have challenges on funding basic operations. So there is no money that's going to be freed up to pay for police.
Well, maybe it will be. That's just it. You do not know. Maybe there will be, and you keep saying the number one priority is community safety. It's great to see the light poles and the flower baskets and things like that, but that doesn't help me when I'm having difficulties and somebody's breaking into my house and nobody can respond because they're responding to 2 other house break-ins.
I think we have a really good sense of what it costs to run the city as well as run the police department. And most of the things we do, since we cut a third of our staff in 2008, as the chief mentioned, most of the things that we do now are things that are mandated by the state. So we're required to do permitting within a certain time period. We're required to do planning, required to maintain public records. We're required to, all these various things we have to do that most residents don't even see as services. They don't see any value to the fact that we have an IT department, right? But state law is requiring us to do all these various things. So when I say that, I cannot foresee that money is going to be freed up from those state mandated services. You mentioned flower baskets and stuff like that. That is such a small amount of money. And it certainly is not enough to fund one police officer.
Be optimistic, maybe, and maybe you need a better lobbyist and quit having the state government picking your pockets all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe you could do that.
Yes, sir.
Hey, can the community outreach officer do sex offender verifications?
Technically, I don't know if that's what we would utilize them for, but
The
yeah.
Sheriff's Department has somebody doing this.
They don't do that in the city. We do our own.
Sheriff,
We do the verifications. We go out and check on them at their residence within the city. The sheriff is in charge of doing the registrations and then they do the checks in the unincorporated
Right,
counties.
that's what I meant, they're doing the, you don't have to worry about the, you may go out periodically and see, is Johnny Jones still on
Correct.
35th and Bridgeport?
We're supposed to, yes, that's the verifications, they do the registrations. Yeah. I know there was a hand over, Gentleman, Jim, something?
Yes, with the climate with the, a lot of police officers getting out of the business, some of them are just retiring or quitting and getting into other areas of employment. Do you anticipate a hard time getting qualified candidates if this levy would pass?
I'm trying to be optimistic that we're going to see what the trend has been for the last year in terms of applicants and recruits, that's going to change here in the next year, that we're going to start seeing that kind of the pendulum swing back to people seeing the value of this career option. I think we're slowly seeing it, but I'm trying to be optimistic about it, that we will start seeing that. I know from a sheriff's department standpoint, I think what was holding us back was a contract negotiation issue, and that's been addressed here just in the last month.
Didn't Pierce County pick up a lot of deputies from other departments who were let go because they've already had the training and everything else, and it was
We
money?
did not. The sheriff's department did not pick up a lot of laterals. Some other the other city agencies were able to pick up some laterals mainly from King County around the vaccination issues and stuff.
Can we make the assumption that then you would hire best qualified?
So the way I would like to think we do that on a regular basis. So we're hiring the best that are out there.
There's a lot of
But-
rumors running around. I just would like you to say, yes, we would hire best qualified.
We do hire the best qualified, but I would also share that as a contract, we get to select those that come work in the city. So it's a process where anybody from in the sheriff's department, they apply to come here, and then we select from those that apply. Yes, sir.
So assuming the levy passes and assuming there's enough applicants and you get, I think by my fuzzy math, you had maybe 6 commissioned and 1 community service.
Correct.
That still doesn't get you to the pre-08 levels. So you're still going to be having some hardships. Are you considering other means like speed enforcement cameras, red light cameras, and like maybe in the school zones? And then other cities, it's been a few years since I've looked it up, but other cities try to entice uniform officers, not necessarily from UP, just to live in your community. Like, hey, though the city would subsidize a house purchased by a law enforcement officer for, like, say, $10,000, is that, regardless of the agency, that put a marked patrol car in a certain section of your city. So those are kind of like soft approaches to getting some of your end result of just visible deterrence. Are those on the table?
We've talked about cameras on a city council level briefly. I haven't had necessarily any movement on that issue. I think there's probably some room to have that conversation continuing forward. Certainly on the school zone speed cameras, I think the majority of people would agree that we need to slow down in our children's paths when they're going to school. As far as some of those other, I'll say benefits or incentives about living in University Place, we haven't had any conversations around those. We have, of your 16, I think we have 4 right now that live in the city. But again, we're with the sheriff's department, so there's some that live in the city that used to work here and they got promoted and now they're in another position, but they still live within the city.
Well, the point, I know around my neighborhood there's a troop that lives in the neighborhood. There's a TPD. And a bad guy doesn't really care what department we're with. He just sees a TPD car in a driveway. So just the fact that you'd be enticing a marked patrol car, because they still got to go to work. So they still got to cross through UP, and who knows, maybe that trooper is going to stop out with a block and disabled somewhere, and that's one less call for service, you guys. And that's just because that individual is going to and from work.
Yeah. It's an interesting idea. I hadn't heard about doing it outside and just kind of opening up. I know there's some HUD programs that are out there where they provide, financial assistance for officers and teachers and whatnot to live in certain communities, but I haven't heard about it from a city standpoint.
I recall off the top of my head, I want to say it was Kent a few years ago that was looking.
But it was probably 4 Kent officers though, right?
I'm sorry, it's been a long time.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, it's just in my head, the general idea, like whatever department, so an officer's got to transmit through UP if they live here.
Yeah.
And that's still a little bit more visibility, a little bit more something might run into on the way to work.
Yeah.
Or come home from
Yeah,
work.
that's a good idea. Yes, sir.
Yeah, two questions. One about the speed traps or camera traps. The percentage of money returned to the city isn't that great, is it? And one other thing, are you still stuck with the state COVID mandatory shot?
Okay, are we requiring vaccination? We do not.
You do not. Good.
No. So the speed cameras is different revenue source than like a normal traffic ticket. On a normal traffic, the officer pulls you over and issues you a ticket. The state gets the majority of that money. The city gets about, if it's this is like 2-year-old data, but it was $129 your standard ticket for, like equipment violation. The city gets like $45. The majority goes to the state.
$80, give or take, the state.
Yeah. And the court will get a little bit of it too, but the city gets a very small, the smallest portion of that.
Some of the the distributor of the system gets a percentage too, correct?
So then on the traffic cameras, the current model is, so it depends on what you charge, whatever the city decides the fee is going to be for that speed limit, right? Because it's a completely different infraction. It's not the state infraction, it would be a city code. And I'm going to use, like City of Edgewood, I believe they charge $165 for speeding in a school zone. $10 goes to the court, and the traffic company that runs the camera, they just charge $5,000 per month for the camera. And then what? Well,
You get enough tickets.
we get the rest of that money on each of those tickets, so roughly $150 of each of those tickets.
Hopefully we're not that bad trying to be a university place, but geez, 5,000.
5,000 for, you would probably do that in a matter of 2 days by the number of violations. So we've already had a survey done. We had the company come out and do an assessment of our school zones. And depending on which school zone it is, we had violations from anywhere from 20 to 30% of the traffic that went through to 80 to 90% of the traffic that go through was speeding at 5 or more over the 20-mile-an-hour school zone.
Is there a zone like 2 over or something where they have a grace a little bit, or is it?
It is whatever we decide at the time, I think is where it is. But we don't have any of those to deal with right now.
One more money question for the gentleman over there. Every year you have this, you talked about the surplus, which is going to dwindle over time. How will I as a citizen know unequivocally that you're placing that surplus in a designated account and there's not a little on the side being siphoned off by other departments?
So, as we mentioned earlier, all of the money goes to the public safety fund. So there is no, a little goes here or there, every dollar goes to the public safety fund.
So there will be a line item on a budget that says public safety fund. Will it be divided between levy and the 6 cents on the dollar, or
because
just
it's a
one
property,
big bucket?
No, because it's a property tax, and right now the city council has designated all of the property tax goes to the public safety fund. That's been for years now. So, and every quarter, the council gets a quarterly report, and that's on our website. They get briefed on it in council meeting, and you want the report, you can see it online under our finance department, and you can see the forecast. It shows the public safety fund forecast, and so all of the money is in there.
Okay, so that means that if you're running short in the others, you can utilize some of that surplus.
No, it stays in the fund. So if there's
No, I'm talking about, you've got that 6 cents for the existing personnel in the department. If you somehow at the end of the year you find out you overspent that, you can take from the excess that you just got from the 1.7 million?
No, we're not going to distinguish between the pre-levy levy and the post-levy levy. All of the levy goes to the public safety
I think
fund.
you're answering my question by saying, yes, you can backfill onto
the existing personnel?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
So it's
that's all I
one
want to
pot.
know, that you can do that.
Yes. And what were you saying?
I was just mentioning about the state audit annually, just make sure we're doing what we said we would.
Yes.
Hi, any questions that I missed from email questions or anything?
Some questions from earlier, about, I think you hit on it when you talked property crime in terms of the region. There's a question about how have our crime statistics increased similar to Tacoma and what our data is showing, and maybe, I think you hit on that with the property crime regionally. Is there any other regional?
Not necessarily. I mean, like I mentioned, in terms of violent crime, there's Tacoma,
Okay.
your urbans are seeing much more.
And then there's some other questions in here about planning to collaborate with neighboring police departments to ensure UP can learn from regarding to crime staffing and community engagement.
We certainly collaborate with other agencies. I would say collaboration or mutual aid on a regular basis, and I talked about that with FERCREST as a huge partner of ours. Outside of community engagement, I think that's not necessarily a collaboration outside of our agency, except for in terms of training. We try to be, regional trained together with in different areas, but our community engagement is very much UP community engagement. It's not necessarily an outside. Although if you were here for Duck Days by chance, you probably saw the large display that we had of all the Sheriff's Department resources that comes along with the contract. So we had our Marine Services unit, not that that's a huge issue for us. We don't have any big bodies of water inside the city, like a lake or anything, but the Marine Services were here. We had the SWAT team here. The bomb squad was here. Our dive unit was here. So we have that regional asset that is a part of UPPD as well.
Active shooter questions about how we train for active shooter, and then spinning on that, do we have a school liaison officer?
So we currently do not have a school resource or school liaison officer. That position is typically funded by the school district. During COVID, when the start of COVID happened and it was no more in-person schooling, the position was eliminated. When they went back into school and had a conversation about adding the position back, at that point seeing this was a Sheriff's Department situation, they did not have the positions available to fill that position. The school district was interested in adding it back, but there wasn't enough staffing to add that position in.
Staffing or funding?
Staffing. Because the school district pays for that position, so it's not a matter of funding, it's a matter of positions. As we move forward with some of these plans, our hope is to, and of course as we talked about staffing coming back and getting more people on board, I think both myself and the superintendent are interested in having that conversation again and seeing about getting a school resource officer in some capacity back working with the schools. Active shooter training. So all of our officers, as a part of the Sheriff's Department, we have an annual active shooter training that is put on. It is in-house training, so it is a full 10-hour day where the officers go out and they practice what it means to make entries into schools. We're practicing when to recognize when to go in, how to make those entries, and the entries could be from 2 officers to 10 to 15 officers making those entries. But that's a full active shooter training that is a part of our annual training curriculum within the Sheriff's Department.
What is the biggest issue the UP Police Department is facing, and how can this levy address this?
Well, hopefully I covered that. Our biggest challenge is property crimes, and I would say the biggest complaint is usually about traffic enforcement, but continuing with the idea of having more police presence and the ability to respond to calls, and then the ability to do that investigative follow-up is going to help address some of these issues going forward and preparing us for the future. As development comes, I feel like we need to be in a position that we're ready to respond and be able to provide that service. Policing, as we talked about, you hire somebody, it takes months to get them hired, it takes 6 months to get them trained. It's not as soon as January comes and we say we want these officers and all of a sudden they're here and ready to go. It takes time to get people onboarded and trained and ready to be a part of the UPPD. So we need to be prepared for the future. We can't continue to wait as the demand continues to grow and our resources are dwindling. Yes?
So if the levy is put before the voters, and it does contain the community service officer. That's a UP employee, so you could hire that person immediately. That wouldn't be the same as like waiting for the sheriff's
Correct.
department to.
The onboarding for that position would be much less than a full commissioned officer. We have to wait about 10 months for that officer to get on board.
Where do they receive training?
The community outreach person, we would do that in-house. There is some programs that are available for community service officers, but really majority of it would be in-house.
Sheriff's Department doesn't have something?
They have a community service officer position, but it is not necessarily what we have envisioned here. It's a limited commission that does like whole vehicle removal, front desk work to take reports, those types of things. This is a position that would be out engaging with the community, which is a little bit different. Yes?
Any additional actual officers are going to be lateral rather than trying
So-
to send them through the academy and incur all that expense as well? Or
So the way the contract works is the city says to the sheriff, hey, we would like to add X number of bodies. The sheriff says, okay, here's when I can give them to you. Typically, it's a 10-month wait because the sheriff isn't going to deplete his resources from somewhere to fill ours immediately. He's going to say, okay, you want 2 more, so this year I'm going to give you X number. We're going to hire them as a part of our hiring group, and once they have reached the on their own status, they go there, and then we open the position and take from all. It's not like we pick candidate A and we follow that person all the way through the process, and then when they're done, they come to us. Candidate A gets through the process and goes to the sheriff's department, and then we pick from candidates B through Z to come work here, so they're experienced officers.
But are they going to be lateral, or are you incurring the expense of sending them to the academy to?
That's part of the contract that pays for all that training. That makes sense.
So you're not getting entry-level positions, but the sheriff is not going to release officers until they've got replacements that have gone through
Correct.
the whole process.
Just like if we were your own agency and we hired somebody on January 1st, that person would not be ready to be working on their own until they've gone to the academy, gone through all the training and hiring process and everything. So it's kind of the same process.
So does all the field training occur with the sheriff's department, or do you do some internally?
We do some here internally. We have field training officers assigned here in University Place, which exposes those officers to what it's like to work in University Place, and that's usually how we get them. Is they get here, get a taste of it, they go back, work somewhere else in the county, and they go, well, that was really kind of nice working in UP, you know. Everybody waves at me nice. So that's usually where we get them. And we have a very seasoned crew here. They've been here for a long time, many years of being in UP, and we don't usually lose anybody. If they leave us, they're up for a promotion or something like that.
So I guess that raises another money issue. If we're not getting off the levy passes in November, it starts in January, we're not going to see officers until October. That's that 10 months. So now you're building a 10-month surplus out of that 1,700,000 that's not going to be expended until you get warm bodies here.
Well, you have to start paying January 1 for that officer. You're paying for them while they're training, while they're going to the academy.
Good negotiations
Well,
by Pierce County.
well, they would be paying for it, right? Somebody has to pay for it. That officer is not going to go to the academy for free. So we're paying for that officer during that whole training process.
Not necessarily the officer coming.
Not necessarily the officer. We're paying for our portion of that, right? And then we get the body. And it's going to be, we're going to have a phased-in approach no matter what to this hiring thing. The sheriff has to see what their hiring projections are and how many they're getting coming in.
And have you had preliminary discussions with the sheriff saying, we're trying to do this? What does it look like down the road in terms of how many vacancies do you have? What kind of a recruitment class? What are you doing? So on and so
There's
forth.
been some communications. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself in terms of trying to nail down the sheriff on something when we haven't even gone to the council yet. We're still in the gathering information and input from the community stages, but as we get closer, for sure, we're going to have those conversations to try and get a very kind of nailed down timeline, at least the best projections that we can get. Sure. Okay. Anything else? Yeah? Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you for what you and the other officers do. I came from a department where it was just 2 people for the county, and we were taking things personally, sleeping on, like losing sleep about the injustice that was happening when we couldn't write up reports. And even though I haven't met the officers, just thank you, because there's a lot.
One more thing. Do you have citizen volunteers, or are you trying to put together such that you can have citizens augment everything else you're planning to do?
Citizens answer calls?
No. Process paper, do any number of things that will allow the officers to go out into the field to do their job.
Yeah, so the majority, processing paperwork is non-existent anymore because everything's electronic. And the officers have computers, printers, everything in their cars. They do all that stuff themselves. It's a part of that. That we used to do, so I was a sergeant here back in 2009. And I can remember we used to have a few citizen volunteers that would work in the station. It presents some challenges because we get them all trained up, and then all of a sudden they decide that they don't want to be a volunteer anymore. And it was really difficult to kind of maintain that. And now with the federal laws around criminal information, we have to do full background checks and polygraphs and everything on even volunteers, if they're in the station and working with any of that information. So it does create some challenges around those volunteers. We do have a reserve program still with the Sheriff's Department. So reserves are volunteers who choose to wear this uniform, not get paid, and they're a fully commissioned officer when they're working, and that's it. But they go through a reserve academy. When they decide to work, they get a patrol car and they go out and handle calls, and they support the officers that are working. For a while there, we had one reserve in University Place. Again, from the Sheriff's Department. He lived near University Place and he liked working here. We just lost him about 6 months ago. He decided to hang it up. So, but when we get them, it's great to have them. But that's where that reserve kind of core comes from, is from the Sheriff's Department. When we find one that really likes to work at UP, we try to keep them here as best we can.
Where do we bring the coffee and the donuts? It's not a bribe. It's just not
right. Okay, anything else on that? Thank you so much for being here and all the dialogue and ideas and input. I do really appreciate it. Like Eric said, that's the intent. None of this is, we want to get feedback from all of you as to what you are thinking about public safety and your ideas. Don't hesitate to shoot us an email if you think of something afterwards, or feel free to give me a call. All that information is on the website and whatnot, so if you have extra questions or ideas, yeah, please shoot my way. So,
Thank you.
thank you so much. Appreciate it.